in the music business, full time, and I guess most of my fans.
No, I played at 10,000, 50,000 people at a time, so it's different.
David Allan Coe's final revelation before his death in 2026 was something few expected. He died at 86 in Dallas, with his wife Kimberly by his side, closing out a life defined by extremes: prison time, motorcycle gang violence, near-fatal crashes, an IRS collapse, and a COVID battle at 82 that almost ended it all. For 6 decades, he lived as both outlaw and mythmaker, too unpredictable for Nashville yet central to its identity. But in his final days...
Breaking news just into CountryCast, David Allan Coe has died. The Outlaw Country legend and songwriter behind Take This Job and Shove It, You Never Even Called Me By My Name, and The Ride, passed away at the age of 86.
Coe reportedly gave his most direct account of the outlaw country movement and the roles played by Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson. What did he finally say? And why does it change the story now? Join us as we break it all down. The original outlaw. David has always been an outcast, right from the beginning. He spent the better part of his life cycling in and out of correctional facilities of various kinds, from juvenile reformatories through his final release from the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield in 1967. The Ohio State Reformatory is now famous as the filming location for The Shawshank Redemption, which is the kind of coincidence that feels almost too thematically appropriate for a man who spent his life performing the role of the wronged outsider with absolute conviction. He claimed for years that he had killed a man in prison and spent time on death row awaiting execution. He also claimed to have taught Charles Manson to play guitar and to have met singer Screamin' Jay Hawkins in prison, who urged him to pursue music. Research into his actual prison records established that while his incarceration was real and substantial, the death row story was almost certainly an embellishment, possibly the greatest piece of personal mythology he ever wrote. He never stopped telling it, and the fact that he kept telling it even when people pushed back is one of the most revealing things about who he was. He had decided what his story was going to be, and he performed it with the conviction of a man who had lived it. When he was released in 1967, he moved to Nashville. He had no money and nowhere to stay, so he parked a hearse outside the Ryman Auditorium and lived in it, performing on the sidewalk outside the home of the Grand Ole Opry for anyone who would listen. The man who would become one of the most respected songwriters in country music history was sleeping in a vehicle outside the building that housed the institution he was trying to break into, which is the most literal possible version of being an outsider. He wrote Johnny Paycheck's signature, "Take This Job and Shove It." He wrote Tanya Tucker's #1 hit, "Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone?" He was the first artist to record Tennessee Whiskey, before George Jones made it a classic and long before Chris Stapleton turned it into a phenomenon that a new generation discovered. He had a legitimate claim to being one of the most important songwriters of his generation. And that claim was consistently overshadowed by his persona, his behavior, and his willingness to say things about his contemporaries that nobody else was saying out loud. And what he said out loud about Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson was the most direct account any insider ever gave of the real tensions running underneath the outlaw movement's celebrated surface. So, what exactly did he say? And why did Waylon Jennings confront him over it? The phrase that revealed everything. The public history of outlaw country places Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings at the center of the movement, with Chris Christopherson and Tom Paul Glazer occupying important adjacent roles, and with David Allan Coe treated as a colorful peripheral figure who contributed songs and chaos in roughly equal measure. Coe spent decades pushing back against exactly this framing. In interview after interview, conducted with the same bluntness that made the cheap suits in Music City completely nonplussed, As one journalist described it, Coe laid out his position without apparent rancor, but with absolute certainty. He said, "I did it. I was singing that stuff for years. I was living it for years. Willie, Waylon, they just got more famous. I was the original outlaw." This was a central piece of his public identity that he maintained across decades. And the argument he was making was not without foundation. While the outlaw movement is generally dated to the mid-1970s, with Willie Nelson's Red-Headed Stranger album in 1975 often cited as its founding document, David had been living the lifestyle that term described: the motorcycle clubs, the prison record, the refusal to accommodate Nashville's commercial demands, long before anyone in the industry had a name for it. The conflict between David's version of the movement's history and the version that had made Nelson and Jennings famous was not just about credit. It was about authenticity, which was the entire philosophical foundation on which outlaw country had been built. If the most authentic person in the movement was the one who got the least recognition for founding it, that said something uncomfortable about the gap between the movement's values and its commercial reality. And then David made it worse by putting the complaint into a song. He wrote Willie, Waylon, and Me, a track that placed himself alongside his two most famous contemporaries, while simultaneously using his other public statements to accuse them of having sold out everything the movement was supposed to represent. The specific irony of writing a song that claimed kinship with Waylon and Willie at the same time he was publicly accusing them of compromise and commercialism was not lost on either Jennings or Nelson. And Jennings responded in a way that made his feelings entirely clear. What Jennings said, and what he did when he confronted David about it, is the most dramatic documented episode in the conflict between them: the bold confrontations. Waylon Jennings described the confrontation in terms that left nothing ambiguous. David had been taking pot shots at both Jennings and Nelson in interviews, saying that Willie and Chris Christopherson had sold out, that Jennings was running around wearing white buck shoes, and that none of them was really an outlaw. He said he was the only outlaw in Nashville. Jennings said he saw David in Fort Worth and put his finger right up to his chest. "You gotta knock that shit off," he told him. That is a physical confrontation between two of the most significant figures in country music history, and the specific detail of Jennings putting his finger into David's chest in Fort Worth is not a vague recollection or a reported rumor. It is something Jennings described himself in clear enough terms that there is no ambiguity about what happened or what prompted it. The white buck shoes comment is worth pausing on. Waylon Jennings had built his entire public identity around a specific and deliberate rejection of Nashville's commercial polish. His negotiations with RCA Records to maintain creative control over his recordings, his insistence on using his own band rather than the Nashville session musicians the label preferred, his refusal to wear the rhinestone suits and the carefully managed image that the industry expected of its stars. These were not small gestures. They were the things that made him a founding figure of the outlaw movement in the first place. For David to accuse him of wearing white buck shoes, a specific symbol of the middle-class conventional Nashville establishment, was the most precisely targeted insult he could have delivered. He was saying that Jennings had become exactly what he had spent his career fighting against. Jennings also described the recording session for Willie, Waylon, and Me with a level of ambivalence that tells you exactly how he felt about David at that point. He actually played guitar on the track, and then, according to people present, he walked out of the studio afterward and said, "Shit, I don't know why I did that." He had participated in a song by a man who was publicly attacking him and his friends, and the question of why he did it appeared to have no satisfying answer even to himself. Willie Nelson's response to the conflict was characteristically different from Jennings's. While Jennings confronted Coe directly and physically, Nelson tended to absorb this kind of provocation, with the specific way that has always made him one of the most impossible people in American music to successfully attack. And David kept going, kept accusing, and kept claiming the title of original outlaw. He kept performing the mythology he had constructed around himself with complete conviction, until the violent explosion of emotions. The festival where everything got violent. The most dramatic episode involving all three men together did not happen in a recording studio or a backstage argument. It happened at an outdoor festival called 48 Hours in Atoka, Oklahoma, where the combination of drugs, alcohol, motorcycle gang members, and a crowd that had assembled in large numbers without adequate infrastructure produced exactly the kind of chaos that eventually finds its way into country music mythology. In a 2003 interview, David described what happened at that festival. He, Waylon Jennings, and Willie Nelson were all performing. When they arrived, women were being raped and people were being stabbed. There was a heavy presence of drugs and alcohol. David told his band not to worry about it because they would provide their own protection. He was wearing the colors of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club at the time and had a pistol in his pocket. This is the context in which the word outlaws was applied to the movement, according to David's account. The name did not originate as a marketing slogan or a Nashville executive's bright idea. It originated, at least partially, in the specific and genuinely dangerous environment of an outdoor festival, where one of the performers was carrying a firearm and wearing motorcycle gang colors because the situation required it. During that period, David moved around the stage during Nelson's concert sets wearing stomping boots, a long earring, a sleeveless Levi jacket bearing Florida outlaw colors, and what the reporter described as a small but prominent swastika. He had, the reporter wrote, a neck the size of a small bull, and he looked very much like the bad customer he claimed to be. The violent atmosphere of the outlaw country concert circuit during that period was not the romanticized rebel country that the genre's retrospective mythology tends to present. It was genuinely dangerous, and the specific danger was something that David inhabited rather than stood apart from. He was not performing danger from a safe distance. He was surrounded by it, and by people who might hurt him, and he stayed anyway. This is the part of the outlaw country story that its commercial legacy tends to smooth over. The music that made Nelson and Jennings rich and respected was rooted in an environment that included real violence, real motorcycle gangs, and real confrontations between people who were not playing characters. But while outlaw country's commercial story is often told through its biggest successes, David Allan Coe's perspective reveals a much more conflicted truth about what that success really meant. What David said about selling out before he died. David spent his entire career in a complicated relationship with the concept of commercial success. He wanted it. He pursued it. He was furious when it went to Nelson and Jennings instead of to him. And he simultaneously held on to the position that anyone who achieved it had compromised themselves to get there. The accusation that Nelson and Jennings had sold out was the most consistent public charge he made against them, and it generated the most consistent pushback from both of them. Nelson tended to let it pass. Jennings put his finger in David's chest in Fort Worth and told him to knock it off. Neither response changed David's position or prevented him from making the same argument in the next interview. The specific commercial success that David was accusing them of compromising for was real. Jennings negotiated unprecedented creative control from a major label, but he still had a major label. Nelson moved back to Texas and recorded music his own way, but he still distributed it through commercial channels and still toured in the commercial environment that generating revenue requires. By David's absolutist standard, any accommodation with the commercial music industry was a betrayal of the outlaw ethos. His own career was not free of commercial contradictions. He wrote for major artists. He signed with Columbia Records. He pursued radio play and mainstream recognition with the same energy he directed toward accusing others of selling out to get them. The gap between his stated position and his actual behavior was something that people who knew him well were aware of, and it is something that his son, Allan Coe, who became a well-regarded music journalist and podcaster, has addressed in public forums with the specific honesty of someone who loved his father while also seeing him clearly. What made David's position both frustrating and fascinating was that he was not entirely wrong. He had lived the outlaw life before it had a name. He had written songs that became classics, while others took the credit and the commercial reward. He had a genuine grievance that was expressed in the least productive possible way, with confrontational public statements that guaranteed alienation rather than acknowledgement. But to understand why David's frustration landed with such force, and why it ultimately didn't change anything, you have to look at what Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson were actually doing at the exact moment he was making those accusations. What Waylon and Willie were actually doing while David was talking. Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson were fighting their own battles with the Nashville establishment that were not less real because they were being fought at a different level. Jennings had negotiated with RCA for the right to produce his own records and use his own band, a concession the label gave almost nobody. Nelson had abandoned Nashville entirely, returned to Texas, and built a following in Austin before the music industry had fully understood that Austin was happening. According to Willie Nelson, in his memoir Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die, he and Jennings were like two old married people. They fought about everything, and if Jennings was for something, Nelson was against it. Their disagreements were constant, covering politics, religion, the phrasing of songs, and production choices. They were great friends who could not stop arguing with each other, and that combination of genuine affection and genuine conflict is one of the more human relationships in the history of country music. Jennings himself was clear-eyed about the limits of the outlaw image. He acknowledged at various points that it was more of a marketing strategy than a pure ideology, and he once said that the most outlaw thing Willie ever did was probably that he came to town and double-parked on Music Row. The self-awareness that Jennings brought to his own mythology was something David was not always prepared to extend to his own. And the specific accusation about the white buck shoes reveals something important about David's relationship with the truth. Jennings had a documented and sustained history of refusing the trappings of commercial Nashville identity. The idea that he was secretly wearing white buck shoes and compromising his identity was more about David's need to position himself as the only authentic figure in the movement than about anything Jennings was actually doing. But regardless of where the truth landed in those arguments, every story in outlaw country eventually reaches the same point. And for David, that point came in 2026, the legacy he left and what his death confirmed. David Allan Coe died on April 29, 2026, at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Time, in an intensive care unit in Dallas, Texas. He was 86 years old. No cause of death was disclosed. His wife, Kimberly Hastings Coe, confirmed the news. She wrote, "One of the best singers, songwriters, and performers of our time, and never to be forgotten. My husband, my friend, my confidant, and my life for many years. I'll never forget him, and I don't want anyone else to ever forget him either." His death closed a chapter of American music that had been open for nearly 6 decades, and what his life and his public statements left behind is a genuinely complicated legacy. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the most gifted songwriters of his generation. He was also a man who spent decades claiming credit he felt had been taken from him by men who became more famous, and expressing that claim in ways that damaged relationships, invited confrontation, and ultimately kept him on the outside of a legacy he was genuinely part of creating. Whiskey Riff, in its obituary, captured the essential tension. While David was often mentioned alongside other outlaw country legends like Chris Christopherson, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings, and even released a song called Waylon, Willie and Me, he would often accuse his outlaw peers of selling out, which drew the ire of Jennings. The tension between the tribute and the accusation, between the song that claimed brotherhood and the interviews that denied it, is the defining contradiction of David's relationship with the movement he helped build. What he confirmed before he died, through decades of consistent and documented statements, is that the outlaw country movement was not the unified brotherhood that its retrospective mythology tends to present. It was a collection of genuinely complicated men with genuinely complicated relationships, built on real talent, real conflict, real commercial pressure, and real confrontations in Fort Worth parking lots and Oklahoma festival grounds where the violence was not performed for cameras, but was simply the environment everyone was operating inside. Do you think David's claim that he was the original outlaw deserves more recognition than history has given him? Or did the way he made that claim ultimately undermine the case he was trying to build? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.